edition of Arlen Close's Trending Treasury series of webcasts. Today we'll be discussing state aid and subsidies, a riveting subject for most of our clients who've had to deal with it throughout the last 10 years or so with the EU state aid regime. We've helped many clients navigate their way through those situations, particularly when making loans to non-public bodies. But following the UK's exit from the EU at the end of last year, the subsidy regime, the state aid regime, has changed somewhat. My name is Nicholas Keeling, and I'm joined today by my colleague Stephen Kitching, who's the Consultancy Director at Arlen Close, and he's a specialist in advising clients on state aid regime and the options around making state aid compliant transactions. Morning, Stephen. Hope you're well.
Good morning, Nick. I'm very well, thank you. I'm sort of looking outside and seeing that the weather's improved quite significantly from the last few days, so feeling a bit more optimistic about everything. How about yourself?
Yeah, all right, thank you. I had my vaccine yesterday. And at the moment, no side effects, so all going well. And we'll probably wait till later today before those hit, I'm sure. Before we get into the discussion, I'd just like to note to our regular viewers may well have noticed a slight change to the format of the webcast. Primarily the way they're viewing it, but also the Q&A function on the right-hand side of the screen. If you do have a question, please drop one in the question box. And we'll try and get to those as we move through the webcast. Okay, Stephen. Well, I guess after the intros have been done, let's move into this. I think the best place to start is looking at the old regime, so the regime we've left. So if you can give us a bit of background on how the EU state aid regime worked, and what was it trying to do, and did it include everything?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, for most of our clients, they'll have bumped up against the state aid regime at some point in their careers. And whilst we were in the EU, so before Brexit, we were part of the EU. It was one of those things that people found a little bit intimidating and a little bit daunting when they had to deal with it, but once you got the general principles in your mind, it was relatively easy to understand. So I mean, the big question was always, are you giving an unfair advantage to commercial organizations? And everything was really built around that principle of trying to make the common market, as we used to call it, and then the single market as it became, a fair playing field between companies. Now, one thing that often would be asked immediately by our clients was, well, this loan or this grant is being given to a company that we own. Does state aid still apply? Is that still a problem? And the answer was always yes, because the state aid regime under the EU's way of doing things was also a way of trying to limit the subsidies provided to nationalised industry. So I'm sure some of our more historically minded viewers, or some of those who perhaps have got a lot more experience in life, will remember the 60s and 70s periods of really high government subsidies for particular industries that governments wanted to support and didn't want to get into difficulties. This regime was a real move away from that, and it was a way of preventing individual governments within the EU of basically massively helping their industries, which would then obviously massively hurt the industries in other countries because of the single market. Now, so that was the whole idea behind it. Now, in practice, the way that worked was looking at, well, did we want to provide funding on, for example, a commercial basis rather than on a subsidised basis? If you did that, you wouldn't need to worry about the state aid regime. But also, when you made an interesting point, which was, well, did it apply to everything? And the simple answer was no. I mean, the most important area it didn't apply to is individuals. You can't say state subsidy an individual. If it was, we wouldn't be able to provide people with housing benefit, and we wouldn't be able to provide people with unemployment benefit and things like that. But also we had this idea of these services which were in discrete blocks, which were also excluded from the state aid regime. And the one that most people will be aware of is the services of general economic interest, and that's how local authorities or other public bodies such as central government can subsidise things like social housing through housing associations. So if you're directly funding housing associations to directly provide social housing is obviously heavily subsidised. That would be an example where there was a clear carve out from the regime. And I think what's really important to remember about the old EU regime before we move on is that the old EU regime built up over time, and over that build up became, some people would say, too prescriptive, but other people would say it became very, very clear. So looking at the arguments around, well, there's a way of working, there's a prescribed way that if you can't find a market rate, you can calculate a quasi market rate if you want to make a loan, or there's a clear limit on the amount of aid that you can provide. All of these things built up over time, we've stepped away from. So we've stepped away from all the case law, we've stepped away from all the specifics, and on the old regime, which for better for worse, and whether you liked it or not, we at least had a framework we just about understood.
I think that's a really good point, actually. You said it was relatively clear at the start, and I was thinking, well, it's as clear as mud in some instances. But you're right, at least you had something to look at and say, well, if we don't think it's this, it's probably this, and this is what we need to do. And right now, of course, since we've left the EU, it's not quite as clear cut as that. Again, if you can use clear as the right word there. So I suppose going forward, I mean, do we need a subsidy regime? We've left the EU. The EU state aid regime was something that was, I suppose you could say, imposed upon us as a member of the EU, and all countries have to have regard to that are in the EU. We've now moved away from the EU. Is that something? Is a subsidy regime something we need to look at and we need to consider?
Well, yeah, we've certainly left the EU and we're no longer governed by EU law, but we are governed by international rules that we've already signed up to. So there's three really main ones that we as public authorities need to consider. And if you're providing any funding in any form to a commercial organisation or an organisation that acts in any commercial manner, you have to be aware of. I mean, the first one of those are the fact that we've voluntarily signed up to the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is a large group, governing the rules of trade between different member states, and they have clear rules on subsidies. Now, the interesting thing about the WTO rules is that they're very, very high level. They're designed to stop massive public subsidies down to very specific consequences for others. So a really clear example of an illegal subsidy under the WTO is any subsidy which is based on the amount you export. So the reason for that being that what you don't want is governments subsidising home for the specific idea of exporting to other countries, which would lead to the destruction of the
Stephen, if I can just stop you there a second, Stephen.
Similar industries in those countries, which obviously decrease. Yep.
You're breaking up quite a lot, and we're getting a bit of distortion. It's probably best if you turn your video off and we'll see if that helps.
Okay, yeah. Just give me a moment.
There we go. And if you could go back to some of what you were saying in the last paragraph, if you like.
can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly clear.
Okay, hopefully that will have improved things slightly. So just to carry on for a moment, just to carry on from hopefully roughly where I was. So those WTO rules that hopefully you heard me mention, they're designed to stop specific issues, and so the most most obvious of those is preventing you from providing subsidies which will basically help your exporters to outcompete the home industries of where you're exporting to. So that's very clearly about stopping the abuse of trade and the abuse of other things. The other two international agreements that really apply here, which I think are a little bit more relevant to our clients and to local authorities generally, are the agreement that we have with Japan, the trade agreement we have with Japan, which again has limits on public subsidies and gives us a broad framework and principles that we expect to both sides to follow. Ironically, the most impactful of all of the things that we've agreed to, which will impact our ability to provide subsidies, is actually our free trade agreement with the EU, the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU. And the trade and cooperation agreement we signed up to gives a very clear list of, well, basically 6 principles that both sides agree to follow. And so we are bound already by, we've left sort of the specifics of the EU state aid regime. And if we discount some of the very prescriptive but extremely high level WTO rules, where we are is we've sort of left a framework, and we're left with principles we've agreed with both Japan and the EU. Now, the EU principles are the most prescriptive of the two, so they're the ones that anybody looking at this would be making sure they're clear that they're looking at. But it's very interesting, because once you actually look at it, the principles are broadly the same as the principles that we were signed up to under the EU. So we've got the fact that any subsidies you do provide need to pursue a specific public policy that remedies an identified market failure. Now, if we sort of take a step back from that, we can say, well, that's very clear that if we look at the social housing element again, well, there was a clear market failure to be able to provide low-cost housing to those who need it. So there was a subsidy provided that, so it's specific. Also, subsidies are proportionate and limited to what is necessary to achieve the objective. Now, many of our clients who've gone through this process will remember under the old EU scheme, the idea of the wedge, the gap between what funding was available and what funding was needed to provide the service, and the fact that local authorities, when they wanted to provide a subsidy, which was legal, could only provide the difference between the two. It could only provide that, and that was sort of a way of giving a level of guidance and a framework in order to provide for a principle very similar to this one, that subsidies should be proportionate and only necessary. So we're already starting to see things that we've agreed to are actually bringing us into the general direction of where we were before. So a lot of the skills that we've built up and a lot of the good work that we've done previously is still relevant. And I think that's quite important, because if we look at the work that's been done by local authorities, a lot of local authorities and a lot of public authorities will be, I don't want to say tearing their hair out, but certainly concerned that agreements they put in place or work that they've done previously to make sure their agreements, their funding of projects was state aid compliant, may now be worried that we're going to suddenly turn everything on its head. And I think these general principles means we're not, or at least we don't have to. Now, the general principles being broadly the same means that what we've done before will pretty much be compliant and compatible with whatever we do later on.
Okay, that's good to know. In terms of, I suppose we've touched on the current situation there a little bit. Now, the government published their consultation to do with this area, subsidy control, designing a new approach for the UK back in February, and that consultation is actually closed on the 31st of March. It does go into mention the principles, and it goes into mention the rules that we have to adhere to within the agreements we've already had. But so what does the government hope to achieve, or what does the government's aim of this new subsidy regime that might be different to the EU?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think that's a question that lots of people have been asking. When we look at the consultation, we see, as you say, the principles that we've signed up to, agreed to. We also see in the preamble that we explicitly don't want to return to the 1970s model of having strategic industries, which we support through subsidy, which would fail otherwise. So they've specifically said they don't want to go in that direction, and instead what they want is something that has a clear approach that's very UK focused. Now, when they talk about being UK focused, I think that they talk about this bespoke UK subsidy regime. It does feel that the big difference they want is that the state aid regime is going to meet the needs of the UK's internal market. So Great Britain and Northern Ireland, so Wales, Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland. And that any changes, any real divergences from the state aid regime of the EU and the new subsidy regime will basically all flow from the idea of the things that maybe didn't work so well when looking for the UK in particular under the old regime are now hopefully going to be remedied. But when you look at what those sort of specific subsidy control objectives are, we've got that UK internal market point that I've just made, and obviously we want to act as a responsible trade partner, which we already have to, we've already signed up. Maintaining a competitive and dynamic market economy is important, and I think that's where any restrictions on subsidy is going to come. But I think the interesting part is this line, this facilitating interventions to deliver on the UK strategic interests, because that seems to contradict what they say in the preamble, which says, well, we don't want to be intervening into these state-run companies, and so trying to pick winners. These ideas, it seems to be against that. But then we've got this facilitating interventions to deliver on the UK's strategic interests, and that's why I think that one of the things that's going to come out of the subsidy regime and come out of this consultation is that a lot of the restrictions on individual authorities, such as local councils, local authorities, are actually going to be broadly similar to those we've got now. The exemptions are going to be broadly similar to those we've got now, and it'll be on a sector-wide, sort of available to all companies, or all types of company, or all specific companies. And when we talk about maybe research and development grants, when we think about those sorts of things, that's where which are very UK focused on sort of UK, on industries the UK wants to grow for its internal market. I think that's where we're going to see a specific divergence from the EU's approach. The EU's approach was very much more, if a country wanted to apply to make a subsidy that didn't fit in with the state aid framework, it applied to the Commission, the EU Commission, and explained why there was a specific reason why this was the case. And I think what the UK and what the current UK government wants to do is move away from authorities having to ask for permission for these sorts of things, and move into a situation where it's clearer, where if this is in the UK's overall interest, and whilst not damaging sort of the market economy too much, we'll be in a situation where there'll be hopefully eventually very clear guidance. But I think what's more, I don't want to say worrying, but what's more surprising perhaps is when you go through the consultation, how much of it starts to ring bells. I mentioned previously the services of general economic interest. Well, there's quite a big section on not services of general economic interest, but services of UK economic interest. So very, very slight changing of terminology, but the description is pretty much the same, where they plan to exclude things like that. I mean, I talked earlier about the idea that, well, you can't give a subsidy to an individual. Well, that is that is in the state aid consultation, that will remain the same. Many clients will remember the de minimis levels on state aid, that you could provide a certain amount of aid over a 3-year period without breaking state aid rules. That's in there too. So you can see that the government, I don't think, has any major beef with what it's agreed to. And also the government doesn't have any major, or at least the civil servants that wrote this don't have a particular problem with a lot of the actual, not only the general principles, but the specifics of the state aid regime. I think what they're looking for is to move from a more seeking permission approach for unusual projects to broaden out the framework and allow authorities to actually make more proactive investments and encourage. I think it's more about developing and encouraging new businesses, whilst simultaneously trying to maintain the prohibition on aid, state aid of the local tinning factory is going bust and we're going to lose a load of jobs. That's one specific company? I don't think they want local authorities to jump in and save companies that are inherently failing. I think where they want to provide subsidies is to say, well, the local tinning factory is doing really well, and perhaps it could employ more people and do more if it could have a specific targeted grant that would allow them perhaps to expand their premises, but for whatever reason it's uneconomic for them to do it now, and then that be the approach. I think you'll always have the ability to provide support if it's on commercial basis, because again, one of the things that's very specifically in this is the idea that to be a subsidy, it has to provide an advantage, and if you're providing things on commercial basis, you're not providing an advantage.
But that's really interesting, actually. The idea that we could support areas in the strategic interest of the whole UK, but not individual companies that might be in trouble. You're right, it hasn't changed much, but definitely that the focus on let's support the best, or the where we think the success may lie, is quite interesting. In terms of, I realise we're coming to the end to some extent of the webcast, but I think we've got a bit to go through with still to talk about. So what's the current situation? What do local authorities or other public bodies have to do right now if they do want to provide financial support, or maybe support's the wrong word, undertake financial transactions with other companies?
Well, it's certainly, like as we've mentioned, it's certainly not a free-for-all. The most important things is sticking to the principles that were agreed in the trade and cooperation agreement, because They're by far the tightest rules that we have at the moment. The big problem is that we don't have any case law, and we don't have any specific rules to fall back on. And so there's going to be a lot of grey area within this. Now, I think if you look through the 6 principles, probably if you want to stick to those current rules, I think what you want to do is actually look and say, well, what are we trying to achieve? And I think there's going to be two elements here. One is going to be actually one of the ways that we made sure we were complying with the old state aid regime was to make sure if we were providing funding, we were doing so on a commercial basis. So, for example, if you're providing a guarantee, you couldn't guarantee a full amount of 100% of an organisation's debt, and if you're providing a guarantee, you would need to be getting something in return for that guarantee. So, an example would be if you had a waste contractor which was borrowing money from another organisation, and they could borrow that money at a lower rate if you provided a partial guarantee. Well, that could be, as long as they passed on the sum of the savings of their borrowing costs, you weren't taking on, you weren't in any, and as long as you could demonstrate that, you weren't breaking any state aid rules, because you were doing so in your own financial interest. You were doing so as any commercial organisation would. Similarly, providing loans to partners or other organisations, we use that good old market economic operator principle that we had. I think that we can continue to use those ideas. If we provide loans at a commercial rate of interest, there is no subsidy. So I think that's the first section. I think there's the sections where perhaps we would have felt a little bit like we were a little bit worried about them, but actually we can continue as long as we clearly document what we're doing and why we're doing it, and that we've done the work to show it's a commercial rate of interest. I think that those sorts of deals, the due diligence can continue as it was before, and we can work in that way. Where it will get a little bit more complicated is where we do actually want to provide a subsidy. And that's where a lot more work is going to be needed. Now, almost the quid pro quo on this is, well, under the old state aid regime, individual companies could make bring a case. So say I'm a housing company, you've given this housing company an unfair subsidy, you breached state aid, and those organisations could sue you. Well, under current UK law, there's no clear mechanism that's been clearly tested for an individual company to actually do that. Any complaint or any issue will have to be done at a state level. So it would have to be the EU feeling that you were causing an issue for trade between the EU and the UK. So the quid pro quo for the fact that it's actually quite difficult, providing subsidies is quite difficult, is that at the moment the risk is lower because there's no way of an organisation that's clear at the moment to complain. Now, that's not to say that you should go and do what you want. What it is to say is that you've got the ability not to panic and think we can't do anything. There isn't the backlog, as we've said. We've not got the issues that perhaps we would have done in the past. So if you want to provide subsidies, sticking to those 6 principles that we've mentioned over and over again is the way you're going to do it. And I think, again, much like providing things on a commercial basis, it's going to be about documentation and about giving a clear trail that you've done things in a way that meets those requirements that you've got. I think another interesting aspect of this, which is perhaps, I don't know what the best way to put it, is perhaps a little bit underappreciated, is how at the moment, these rules are basically torn up because of coronavirus. Pretty much all of the programs that we've had would have not met the state aid rules, but all the state, everybody's made an exception. The European Commission's waved everything through, all of the understanding that actually local authorities being given some money and then providing grants to local businesses to keep them going, grant schemes, all of these things, this is all an extreme circumstance. And so I think what we'll see is, whilst we're still in the crisis, and though we are coming out of it, we are still in a crisis economically. I think any support we provide will, as long as it meets the principles, will be fine. And I think that when we start to come to the recovery phase, which is a period I think that local authorities will end up being quite heavily involved in supporting the local economy, that's when we'll start to get a very clear framework from the UK government, which means that things are slightly less up in the air. But at the moment, I think the most important things are to follow those principles, to get good advice, both from a legal point of view, but also from a commercial point of view. Lawyers will tell you that will be able to tell you that a subsidy has to be proportionate, but they won't be able to help you with the business analysis to actually work out how much funding, what the funding gap is. And so I think there's a place for that sort of hard work that can be done.
Definitely. We know from our own experiences that the assistance we could provide, particularly from Ireland Close, around those business cases really pushed many of those projects through beyond what the legal profession could say. I think on that basis, at that point, we'll end. So thank you, Stephen. I found that very, very interesting. Hopefully our listeners did too. As I said at the start of the program, we are testing a new format today. So we'd be very pleased for any feedback from listeners. Please drop through your comments to where you can see the email on the screen there on the slide, workshops@irelandclose.com. Other than that, if you do have any questions on state aid or I should say the new subsidy regime, please come through to either Stephen or myself, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.